Thank you so much to Nandana for organizing this series. I'm really honored to be here in Hamilton and at McMaster, and I thank McMaster and the Socrates Project for holding this great series. I haven't been in Hamilton for a long time, but I actually grew up a little bit here, so it's nice to be back in a familiar place. And I also want to say that, even though I'm here giving this public lecture, it's impossible for one person to be an expert in all things. And so hopefully with a big topic like climate change, we can have more of a conversation later on. I actually tried to get some students to come join me. As Nandana knows, I was bugging her about that, but they were actually all too busy, so it's just going to be me, unfortunately. I've had to adjust my slides a little bit. I made them yesterday, and so I'm gonna maybe we'll be reading a little bit off my paper just to make sure I'm catching up properly. So as Nandana mentioned, I work at the University of Toronto, and I practice emergency medicine, but most of the time my other work focuses around issues of health equity and determinants of health. And what I mean by that is that a person's health, yours and mine, is dynamic and is changing. And those changes are determined or influenced by various factors. So there's obvious biological factors like your age and genetics, for example. And there's lots of social economic elements as well, such as income and geography and education, gender, and many others as well. Healthcare access is a major player in that as well, but certainly not the biggest one in a lot of ways. Healthcare plays a role in preventing disease or treating illness and guiding access to other services. And of course, there's the environment. And so the environment we live in contributes to our health. The air we breathe, the water we drink, and the spaces we come into contact with in our daily lives. And so, this is a very long segue into the talk, but what I'm trying to do is provide some context to, how I'm going to be framing climate change, which is that it's not just an environmental issue. As we know, it's also affecting our lives and our health in various ways. And I'm also talking about health partly because it's a doctor, and so that's kind of what I know, but also because health is what allows us to enjoy our lives and makes life worth living. And so the title of this talk, I've made it Resilience in a Changing Climate. And what do I mean by resilience here? So what I mean is that it's our capacity to recover from challenges. It's our ability to bounce back from difficulties that we encounter, and so to be resilient in a changing climate means more than just adapting to it. It also means being prepared for it, and being resilient can also be an opportunity for making our communities stronger to withstand the risks coming from climate change. And so I'll start talking about what we need to be resilient against with this graph. I'm sure lots of people in the audience have seen this before. I'm sure you know what this is. It was made by someone named Edward Xie, and it's a graph of annual temperatures. This one in particular is for Toronto, going from the mid-1800s to now. And you can see that over that period of time, there's been steady, gradual, and continuous warming. And it does fluctuate up and down, but the trend is pretty obvious at this point. And this is in the news very frequently, so I'm sure we're all familiar with it. And the problem is that this puts our ecological balance at risk. We're having trouble maintaining what is a comfortable and healthy environment for us to live in. We're literally pushing ourselves out of a zone of safety into a territory that's unsustainable for the future. For example, for your children, if you have children. So I'm going to start by telling you about one of my patients. This is something I encountered during a recent summer. I had this patient come into the ER after collapsing from home, and she was rushed in by ambulance. It was a swelteringly hot day. It was in the middle of a heat wave, actually. It was over 30 degrees that day. And she was an elderly woman, and as she was being wheeled into the emergency department, you could tell that she was in trouble. Her skin was really flushed. She was struggling to breathe. All of her muscles were really straining to move air. And the issue was that she lived alone. She'd been stuck inside her apartment. She used a walker, and so she couldn't easily go outside to go to a mall that was air conditioned, or go to a cooling center, or even just to have some fresh air. And she also had low income, so she didn't have air conditioning either. She had been feeling unwell already for a few days, but because she had all these issues, she was a bit too weak to get to see her doctor, and so things just kept getting worse and worse. And the other added part to this was that because she was elderly, she was at higher risk from the heat as well. Her body just couldn't adjust to it as well. That's a combination of medications that she was on. We know that as people get older, they're on more medications. We also know that the heart may not be pumping as well, and so it's harder to circulate blood around to get rid of that heat. Also, older people don't feel thirst as much, so she might have been dehydrated. And because of her medications and because of natural changes, she might not have been sweating as much, which is our body's natural way of getting rid of some of that heat. So when it's hot outside, the veins on the surface of our skin get bigger, and more blood flow goes to the skin, and that is underneath the sweat like a radiator, and as the sweat evaporates, it cools the body down. So her body was not as well set up for that, and so elderly people like her are at higher risk. And what happened in this case was, because it was a very hot day, there was also quite a bit of smog, and that made matters worse. So those were the two environmental factors, the heat and the pollution, and they combined with these other determinants of health in her case. So her poor housing, her low income, her chronic medical conditions, to create a deadly situation for her. But thankfully, she got better, and many people don't in similar situations, unfortunately. So, the statistic of 120, this is an older one. This is actually a Public Health Toronto estimate that every year about 120 deaths have some relation, some association to extreme heat. A couple of summers ago, this was in 2018, just in a single heat wave in Quebec, over 60 people died in Montreal alone. I think there was over 90 across Quebec in total. And this is the sort of thing that we're expecting to get worse over time. My patient was lucky, but the future is kind of worrying. And what we already know is that Canada is warming twice as fast as the global average rate. And so, you might hear on the news that the Earth has already warmed by about 1 degree Celsius. Canada, it's closer to 2 degrees Celsius. The best available knowledge that we have says it's about 1.7 degrees so far, and continuing to get warmer. So this is that map of Canada in the bottom corner. That is produced through Natural Resources Canada. They had scientists studying the issue. They produced a great report last year, and it shows, the darker, more red colors show warmer areas of the country. So we know that the northern areas, the western areas of Canada are disproportionately affected. They're actually warming much faster than 2 times the global average. It's kind of hard to see the graph behind it, but these are the temperatures in cities across Canada, going from west to east and then up north. And this is temperature changes that are going to happen over the next 60 years or so. And you see that the area that we're in now, kind of in the middle, is set to increase by a few degrees in the next few decades if nothing is done about climate change. It's kind of striking as well that you can see that the cities in the north at the other end, Whitehorse, Yellowknife, Iqaluit, those bars are much longer because they're going to heat up even more. So if things continue unchecked over the next few decades, we're going to be putting a lot more people at risk. But actually, that's not how most of us feel climate change. And I often, I start with that story, but I have some trouble answering that question sometimes when people say, what are the effects of climate change that you see in the ER? People are naturally interested, of course, in how climate change can emerge as these critical events, like when someone gets really sick or when there's a big extreme weather event. They ask questions like, was this hurricane because of climate change, or was this fire because of climate change? I think we do need to get over that and acknowledge that climate change is making everything worse, and it's not necessary to pin any particular event on climate change. I'm going to use a basketball analogy, which is a really terrible idea because I don't actually follow basketball. I'm going to try it out anyway, though. So it's kind of like asking the Raptors, did they win, a playoff game last season because of Kawhi Leonard? And if you ask a scientist this, they're going to say, well, I don't know. That's not a yes or no question. What they can tell you is that, Kawhi Leonard, he contributed this many points, he had this many rebounds, he had this many passes, and he played on a team and the team won. So did he have a role to play? Yes, but did he cause the team to win? I don't know if we can say that. We can just say that, he really increased the chances of its winning. And it's the same deal with climate change. Even if it's one of the factors, it can be a major factor, and we know that it generally increases risks. And sometimes, you might hear in the media that way of looking at it is used to downplay the impact of climate change. So, some of the things that have been said in the news about the fires in Australia, they're saying, well, climate change is one of the factors. That's true, but it's a factor that is steadily increasing and getting worse and becoming more concerning. So it's not an excuse to not take it seriously. After I made this slide, I actually drew a better picture, but because this is in here, we're just going to use this one. It's my lazy doctor image. So you might recognize this as an EKG tracing or a tracing of heart rhythms. Actually, I'm just going to use it as another graph. So, we can imagine that this is looking at the harms of climate change over time. And so we're starting in the corner over there at the low end, and it's just continuing to get worse and worse. And the reason why I wanted to show this is that climate change has these two types of effects. There's one, which is that slope, that slant up to the corner, and those are the process of the slow onset effects, the gradual warming, the increasing risks over time, and then every so often that gradual worsening, that steady worsening over time, is punctuated by these spikes, which are the extreme weather events. What's important to remember is that, even though we focus on these extreme events like the storms and fires, things are continuing to get worse all the time. But it's just harder to notice that day to day because it's not how we work. We don't really see things that well on that time scale. The issue is that if we just focus on the spikes, we kind of miss out on this idea that there's actually a literal rising tide of harms that's coming. So while climate change is one of the multiple factors that contributes to problems, it's becoming more and more prominent, becoming more and more dangerous. What does that mean for us? Well, in Canada, where we are now, it means too much and not enough at the same time. And so I'm going to just use the next little bit to talk about some of the effects here, especially as they relate to health. So what do I mean by too much? Too much water, for example. So, we know across Canada, and it's going to vary location by location, but overall we know that there's going to be more precipitation in the form of rain and in the form of snow. The issue with that is that it'll be mostly concentrated in winter and spring. And when snow melts, it causes flooding. And so lots of areas where we've built our homes, where we've built our businesses, where there's public buildings, could be at higher risk of floods over time into the future, and higher risk of damage and destruction. That would include places where people go for healthcare as well. And the other risk is that there could also be not enough water. So there's also projected to be less rain in the summer, including in southern Canada, especially in southern Canada. And hotter temperatures as well mean that more of that water is going to be evaporating, which means lower river and lake levels, which means there's less water available for crops and, for things like drinking, for example. And in Canada, where we have, such a great fresh water supply, that may not seem like a huge issue yet, but there's many parts in the world that I'll talk about later where it will be. I put this picture in there on purpose, and I hope I did this right. Does anyone recognize this at all?
Dundas Peak.
Yeah, that's right. That's great eye. So this is Dundas Peak, which is very close to here, and I've hiked up. It's a beautiful place. Okay, I got another question on the next slide here. Does anyone know what these red patches are? This one's a bit harder. Yeah, so I heard tropical, I heard hot spots. These are areas of the world where the mosquito that transmits dengue are. And so these are the areas of the world where you can be exposed to dengue. And the reason why I show this is that dengue is a very temperature sensitive and weather and climate sensitive disease. And if you look across the world, it's in this band because those are the places where the conditions are suitable for it. And temperature is one of the big contributors to that. So it needs a fairly warm environment to grow and reproduce and be able to infect humans. And we've usually been protected from that. We have relatively cool climates. We have winters that kills all the mosquitoes. The issue is that, as Canada's been warming, we are starting to find these mosquitoes. And so for the first time in recorded history in 2017, the mosquito that can transmit dengue, that can transmit Zika, that can transmit yellow fever, some of those might sound familiar. It was found, for the first time, it was found in Windsor, and it's been found during summers since then as well. And so lots of these things that we thought are, far away, that are distant issues, are going to come towards Canada as well. And right now, we're worried about things like West Nile virus. As more mosquitoes of different types move into Canada, it's going to add into those concerns as well. And I don't think any of us wants to feel afraid to be outside because of issues like this, right? We like to enjoy the outdoors. Okay, I'm not going to make anyone guess what this is. What this means to say is, dengue hasn't come to Canada yet, but there is something else that's already here and is growing bigger. And maybe it's hard to see at the bottom here. I've got a time scale, and this is a disease that has increased more than 8 times between 2012 and 2017, and is still increasing. And these numbers are for Ontario, and it's for Lyme disease. And it's very similar to the mosquito, actually, where the tick needs warmer temperatures to survive, and when we have warmer winters and warmer the rest of the year, the tick finds it easier to stick around, essentially. And so the number of Lyme disease cases in Ontario has increased this many times between those years, but is actually even higher now. And if you think Ontario is bad, if you ever go to Nova Scotia, you better tuck your pants into your socks because it's even worse there. Okay. There we go. And I'm just going to go over some more effects as well. It's better to get all the grim stuff out of the way so we can talk about different fixes later on. Air pollution is sometimes not talked about in the same sentences as climate change, but they are related. They're different but related. So we know in Canada, this is from a Health Canada estimate, that there's more than 14,000 people a year die early because of air pollution. And we know about half of that, over 7,000 people a year, die from air pollution that's due to fossil fuels. Okay, so the burning of those fossil fuels not only contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, contributes to climate change, but also can have an effect on people's health through air pollution. And that's through lung disease and heart disease. All right. We're also going to see that the risk of forest fires across Canada is getting worse. And that's because of our drier and hotter climate. So I'll specifically mention here Fort McMurray. I'm sure everyone's heard about this. Did climate change cause the fire around Fort McMurray? Again, that's not quite the right question to ask, right? But how much did climate change contribute to that? How much did climate change increase that risk? So to remind ourselves, the fire happened in 2016. It was huge. 80,000 people had to be evacuated from their homes in Fort McMurray. The damage that was caused just in terms of insurance losses was over $3.5 billion. And that doesn't count all the losses, that's just the insured losses. And scientists were able to look at the fire, look at the conditions around the fire, and calculate the contribution that was made by climate change using models to the best of their knowledge. And so they were able to figure out how much climate change had to do with the higher risk of fire. They found that the fire season was longer, and that the long fire season was 4 times more likely because of climate change. And there was also at the time an extreme fire risk level. And that's something that's reported by the Government of Canada. But the extreme level of risk was 6 times more likely because of climate change, the best for knowledge. So, it is playing a major role. Maybe in that case, it could have even been the MVP of the team. And finally, what I talked about before in terms of Lyme disease, the tick that causes it is called a black-legged tick. And on average, from what we know in Ontario, it's moving north in Ontario by about 46 kilometers a year, which is huge. It's just a tiny little thing, and it's going steadily north by that much every year. There's other effects as well. This is a quote from a report that I really like, and it was a report looking at the experiences of people in an Inuit community in northern Labrador. And one of the community members had said, it's hurting in a lot of ways. They're talking about how the climate had been changing, because I kind of think I'm not going to show my grandkids the way that we used to do it. And the reason why they're saying this is, and this is based off of a lot of other comments from other community members, is that the community is much closer to the land, and they rely on it for things like travel. And so if you need to cross ice and snow to get somewhere, and that's your usual way of getting somewhere, if that ice and snow becomes more unpredictable, if you're not sure if there's hazards there, if you're worried about disappearing through the ice, it has a major effect on your ability to get around. It causes worry in the population as well. And it can be a problem of access to healthcare. Like if the clinic or the hospital requires you to go over an ice road, maybe you won't be able to do it anymore during the times of the year that you expect to. The other major issue that came about was that there were traditional sources of food. And these are extremely culturally important to the community. And the seasons for them to be growing and the places that they're growing were changing as well. And so this was contributing to a feeling of dislocation, of displacement, even though they hadn't moved at all. And they were losing this environment that we're familiar with. Losing a way of life. And, in that community, they were feeling it much more than myself being an urban dweller, because they were much closer to the land. And, there's a term that you might have seen in different articles or papers or people talking about it called Solastalgia. And it's this term that was coined to capture this idea that you're grieving something that's no longer there in the environment. And I think that really captured the feeling, the general feeling that was in the community there. And so, I want to bring this back to the title of the talk, which is Resilience in a Changing Climate, and just to ask the question of what I meant by resilience. And in this case, we can, think of resilience as experiencing the effects of colonization over time and still being able to maintain traditional practices, still being able to maintain a language and a culture and a community. But all of that is being made more difficult by climate change. But there's a great deal that we should be learning from people who have experienced this, who've shown a great deal of resilience about, experiencing marginalization and then figuring out how to become stronger and come together as a community. There's a half-finished slide for you. This is, I think I meant to say extreme weather events. That's what I was getting at here. So extreme weather and different disasters that are caused by climate change. So that would be the fires and storms and floods and droughts. They can hurt us directly by downing trees, for example, or destroying homes or contaminating water. But they can also hurt us indirectly by cutting off services, by cutting out electricity, by blocking our way to healthcare. I don't know if everyone knows this, but I work in a hospital, and when there's a power outage, the hospital stays open, the lights stay on, people can still operate, we can still have our oxygen machines going, and that's because the hospital has a generator. But usually the generators can only run for a certain period of time, like they actually need fuel to run. And if there's a major disaster that knocks out the power, if our hospitals are not resilient, if our healthcare systems are not resilient enough, that could actually affect the services that we're able to deliver. The other example that I came across while I was reading about this was a few years ago. When there was a shortage in a medication called saline. So that is basically just salty water, and we use it because it's kind of similar to what our blood is like, the different chemicals in the blood. It is probably one of the most used medications in hospitals. When people come in and they're dehydrated or they're feeling faint or something like that, we usually hang a bag of this stuff, and it makes people feel better, and it can bump up their blood pressure, and it's very useful. There was a shortage across North America, mostly in the US, but also in Canada. Hospitals across the country felt this. And it was, again, there were multiple factors in it. There was already not quite enough to go around. There were some problems with producing it. But the other thing that happened was that in Puerto Rico, there was a major plant there that produced this medication, bags of saline, and a hurricane had hit Puerto Rico and damaged the plant. It was no longer able to produce the medication, and so what was already a not very good situation became a drastic situation where there was a severe shortage of it. And if we look at the healthcare system in Canada, a lot of the materials and the resources that we use to provide healthcare are not made in Canada. They come from other parts of the world, and so indirectly, different disasters, different extreme events around the world can affect our ability to provide healthcare here and our health if things are not available. All right, and that leads into this next point, which is around scarcity, about not having enough of these resources. And what I meant to talk about was talking about scarcity in terms of a global context. Because we live in a globally connected world now. So, for example, a lot of our food comes from South America. A lot of our phones and tech comes from China. A lot of our furniture gets made in Sweden. The future of Canada is really interwoven with what's happening in the rest of the world, the future of the rest of the world. And if we look at the world and we see that water is drying up and diseases are spreading and fires are burning, there can be less to go around. There can be more scarcity. And sometimes that's not a bad thing. So sometimes scarcity brings people together. So I'm also looking at the news this week and hearing these reports about what's happening in Newfoundland, where they just had a huge snowstorm. I think it was like over 70 centimeters of snow in a very short period of time. If you haven't seen it yet, go on the internet and have a look. The pictures are astonishing of, cars completely buried and snow going up to roofs. But we also saw that people were sharing supplies with their neighbors. When some of the snow got cleared, taxis were giving people free rides to grocery stores. And so in some cases, scarcity can actually, encourage people to help each other out. And it's actually a really heartening thing to see. But too much scarcity can bring people together in a negative way. And if you're living in a part of the world where your neighbor also doesn't have food or water, that can lead to some pretty dangerous things that can lead to conflict. And I'm not going to get into that in detail because I think one of the other speakers in the series will probably address it. But it's something that we should be worried about, and we are becoming more attuned to, as this happens in more parts of the world. And we're beginning to feel the effects of that in Canada as well. I talked about how a lot of our food comes from different parts of the world. There was this report that was just released, I think it was last month, and it was put out by scientists from University of Guelph and Dalhousie University, and it was a report that looks at food prices in Canada. And they were estimating that the cost of food to the average family in Canada is going to go up by about $400 in the next year. That's a lot of money, and they specifically said that one of the reasons was because of climate change, because it's harder to grow crops, it's harder to move those crops around, and this is how this, Canada being in a globally connected world means that we're going to feel the effects of things that are happening in other places. It's also important to remember that that's a lot of money. We know that in Canada, 1 in 7 households is food insecure. They may not, always be able to put enough food on the table, and so $400 can be make the difference between having a meal and going without. So it's a pretty drastic issue. So this is another map of the world. I'm not going to make you guess what this one is either. This is a map that looks at water scarcity in the world. And one of the most dangerous effects of climate change that we're less affected by in Canada, but we are seeing is water scarcity, is drought. The darker colors on this map represent more water scarcity, more water stress, and so higher risk of drought. And in the areas where there is that water stress, it's going to put extreme pressure on the populations in those areas. And I was talking about sharing things between neighbors. Well, what if you live in one of these countries that borders another country and your neighbor doesn't have enough to share either? This can create conflict, and it is a little bit scary to think about how that could affect different parts of the world and how that could affect Canada as well. This is a different map, although it did look quite similar to the last one. And this one is looking at vulnerability to climate change. And so this was another group of scientists. They looked at a whole bunch of different factors, and they put it all together, and they added it all up essentially into this chart. And we see also here that the darker color means more vulnerable to climate change. So despite all the harms that we are seeing in Canada, that we're expecting to see in Canada, we're still, on average, much better off than other parts of the world like Latin America, like Africa and Asia. And the issue is that all this progress that we've made in the last few decades, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty actually wrote this in a report. They quoted 50 years. All this progress we've made, climate change threatens to undo. They think undoing 50 years of progress in development and global health and poverty. This is disproportionately going to affect other places in the world, but because we rely so much on each other, on other countries, this is not something that we can ignore. I'm going to leave the other speaker to take on this topic at a future session. So I've described a lot of different things about climate change, different effects. Hopefully it's painted a picture that the issues that we care about, the issues that affect our lives, our health, our security, our economic well-being, our environment, they're all interrelated to climate change and to each other as well. if I wanted to make this better, I'd make everything interlock, which is probably a better way of showing it, but you can only do so much with PowerPoint. That brings me to talking about these relationships, talking about these connections. And I want to pause here on this unfinished slide as well to describe some of the reasons why climate change is so challenging to tackle. And I'm going to squeeze a ton of ideas into this one slide. So the first relates to why it's hard to just do something, why it's hard to just act on climate change. And one of the reasons that I came across when I was studying and reading about climate change is it's actually really well encapsulated in this term that I came across. It's that climate change is a wicked problem. And I see some nodding heads. So this is a great term, describes climate change really well. And what it's saying is that it's hard to think of and examine all the different facets of climate change in our minds because it's always changing. And it's hard to take an action and see any immediate consequences. And sometimes we can take an action and the consequence will be contradictory to what we thought it would be. It's also hard to see and feel and know that it's affecting us right now. And as I've already talked about, it's hard to know what is climate change and what is not. And because of that, it's really hard to just do something and hope that we're going to make a change because we don't always see the result right away, or sometimes maybe not at all. And the second thing I wanted to talk about, one of the reasons why climate change is really challenging is that it's perverse. It's a perverse problem as well. It's not just a wicked problem. I said a moment ago, and I've touched on this throughout as well, that in Canada we're well off compared to the rest of the world. Well, that's just on average. In Canada, and same as in other countries around the world, the people who contributed least to climate change are the ones who will be harmed the most, unfortunately. The map that I showed of all the countries that are, that showed their vulnerability, the red one, well, if we look at where the greenhouse gas emissions are being produced, it's basically the opposite map. It's the countries that are least vulnerable that have produced the most emissions. And that hardly seems fair, does it? And so that brings me to the last point, which is the one that's actually on the slide. Because it doesn't really feel good to think about that, to know that. And it's sometimes can make us feel better if we run away from that feeling. But we can also try to understand it and try to improve the situation by looking at the situation in different ways. And so one of the approaches to it is this relational approach. And what I mean by that is that, going back to these connections, so looking at how we're connected and how we're interconnected with each other. This relational approach means that we think about relationships with historic circumstances, with our economic, social, and political conditions that shape our lives and continue to shape how we move forward in our lives. And it's important to examine that broader field of different issues, because if we narrow our focus too much, we'll miss the forest for the trees. And we also miss out on opportunities to find approaches to addressing climate change that are better fits for our society, that are better fits for all of our interests, that might be critical to finding some ways of alleviating the harms. It's also important to keep in mind that we don't always get to choose the circumstances that we live in. So, for example, I live in Toronto. I came to McMaster for this talk. And yes, I chose to take the train here, but that's because sometime in the past there was a public investment to build the train tracks here. And I also had enough money to buy the train ticket to come here. And the land that the tracks are laid on is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, and others as well in the past. And the land is protected by the Dish with One Spoon agreement. which means that I have an obligation to share the land and to take only the resources that I need so that people can continue to thrive on the land into the future. And the reason why, and I think this has also probably come up in the past as well, the meaning of that, the name of that agreement, the dish was one spoon, is that everyone eats from the same dish, and so I should try to only take what I need from it. And hopefully that kind of approach actually takes us away from thinking about credit and blame. It still keeps responsibility in there. I chose to take the train here because I was fortunate enough to do so, but also because I had a responsibility to do so. And if I didn't live close to a train station, I might not have had that choice to do so. And so I want to show this quote, which I thought really captured that. And this is from a gold prospector in the Amazon. And he's quoted by the author of a piece called John Lee Anderson. And he said, all of us here realize that we're messing up the environment. It's not like we want to, it's that we haven't found any alternative means to survive. So what he's saying is, I'm not fortunate enough to have better choices available to me. So how can we provide better options for people who are disadvantaged, who can't make these better choices because of the circumstances around them? And how can we be accountable to the good choices that we have available to us? This is, what some people have said on this. The president of Microsoft said, ultimately, we need better technology. And I'm not saying that technology isn't going to play a big role in this, but unfortunately, technology doesn't really address the issue of options that are available to people. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, as you can see in this photo, and as you see around you every day, technology can also disconnect people from each other, can also create distance between people as well. And it doesn't give us approaches to what are fundamentally social and relational problems, such as consumption, and such as the need for jobs and livelihoods that don't destroy the environment. And also, fundamentally, technology is created by people. So ultimately, if you don't build in that perspective of relationships, you don't get technology that is fair and inclusive. You don't get technology that's sustainable and durable. You don't get tech that's affordable where it's needed, is accountable to the good of society and the interests of the people, which are us. I'm going to go through some other examples of this where there's kind of this disconnect between what we actually want and the options that are offered to us. I think originally I had wanted to talk about a dam in Honduras, but I'm going to talk about one in Panama instead, which is actually quite similar. And this first example is about how interests of oppressed groups are often sacrificed to the benefit of more powerful people. So this is, it's actually not what this picture is of, but I'm talking about a dam in Panama. It's called the Barro Blanco Dam, and it's a renewable energy project that was started several years ago. It was meant to reduce the emissions from their electricity supply. So it's actually this is part of the plan. This is what we want. We want cleaner electricity. But unfortunately, despite knowledge that there would be settlements and medicines and sacred places of thousands of Indigenous people that would be flooded by this development, the companies that were making it didn't consult or obtain consent from the affected communities. And so, I think the cautionary tale from this is that technology cannot be used as an excuse for economic domination, for devaluation of local knowledge, and for reproducing inequities. And in this case, there were also violations of human rights along the way as well. So for example, in 2007, the United Nations made a declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples. And Article 24 states that Indigenous individuals have an equal right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. And Article 26 says, Indigenous peoples have the rights to the land, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. But we know that in many places in the world, lands have been taken from Indigenous peoples and many other groups as well, which makes them disadvantaged, which makes them marginalized. And from a health perspective, we also know that the trauma of colonization affects well-being through unjust access to healthcare and gross inequities in the social determinants of health, which I spoke about before as well. So these are some issues that we absolutely need to take into account when we're developing these projects. This project, fulfilled one interest, but definitely trampled on some others. Another example, which has come up recently, and a colleague of mine had recently written an article about this in the Maclean's, and so if you look up Jane Philpott and Samantha Green, they have an article talking about climate change and HIV. So the HIV epidemic started in the 1980s and 90s, and one of the early issues when drugs were first developed for it was that they were very expensive. And they were only available to those who could pay, and so prices for the drugs stayed high while millions of people suffered and died. And so there's this disconnect between the technology that's meant to solve the problem and the people who actually need that technology. And we can talk about tobacco as well. And actually, in this case, we can use tobacco as a model for how we can be more effective at reducing the impact of climate change. So I found this picture on the internet, but I'm pretty sure it's Aldershot Station, which I thought was kind of cool. So what did we do with tobacco? We now know that it's bad for you. When it became impossible to ignore that, we as a society decided to regulate it. We raised the price on it. We tried to contain it in a way that avoided harming people through secondhand smoke. And similarly with pollution of other types, that's the same reason why we have no idling signs outside of schools, because we don't want to hurt our kids with air pollution. But how do we stop the rest of the world, or how do we stop idling in other places that are not schools? And that's where it's important to try to find some coherence. And by that I mean finding alignment between all the different interests that we have and the interests of the communities that we're living in. How do we act in a way that's true to what we want, that's true to our values? So we want to avoid some of these issues where we have competing interests and one interest wins out over another. What's our goal? Maybe we'll talk about that first. So I think we can all agree that what we want is a safe and clean and healthy environment to grow up in. We want jobs that don't pollute or exploit other people, where we have options that we can feel good about, where we don't have neighbors who are struggling to make ends meet, who don't have enough food to put on the table. Remember, 1 in 7 households. And this is what's happening in Ontario now in terms of idling. This is the average footprint of the average person who lives in Ontario. This was produced last year by the Environment Commissioner of Ontario at the time, who's Diane Sachs. And the top 4 that she had talked about were contributions to greenhouse gas emissions for someone in Ontario would be driving, home heating, flying, and eating beef. And again, this is not a blame issue. You can ask, why do Ontarians drive so much? But that's actually maybe not the most appropriate question. I think the most appropriate question might be, why do people in Ontario have to drive so much? And if we look at technological solutions to this problem, like electric vehicles, they're great. They reduce emissions, but they don't solve the problem of why you need one in the first place. And I'm talking about need here, and I'm very cognizant that, you know, I live in a big city and I'm talking to an audience that lives in Hamilton, that's an urban area, and acknowledging that the same solutions are not going to work for everyone in every situation. So electric vehicles do reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions. But making electric cars still takes a lot of energy and materials, and you still need the roads and parking lots for them. And cement is actually one of the biggest contributors to emissions. Actually, when people, you know, add up how much emissions different countries produce, it's usually burning of fossil fuels and making of cement that are the two biggest categories. So they're good, but how can we do better as a way of you know, improving the situation? And that's where it can be useful to find alignment. And I'm going to try to avoid being prescriptive here. I'm going to try to avoid saying this is what I think we should do, and just describe some of the things. So this is an example that is aligning interests in the hospital I work in. So for example, you know, from a sustainability perspective, turning off lights saves electricity, saves energy. From the care of my patient's perspective, patients sleep better when they're in a dark room. And you know, from the finances of the hospital, turning off lights saves money. And so these interests are all aligned. You know, if I'm not using the light, I should turn it off. This makes a lot of sense. And we can sort of look at other issues that way as well. So something like public transit, you know, environmentally it cuts pollution. From a health perspective, it encourages physical activity, it encourages people to walk in their communities, including past, you know, shops and businesses that are close by. It includes, you know, it also encourages people who are neighbors to see one another and visit each other. And it's also cheaper than owning and maintaining a car. And we can look at, you know, diets that have plants in them the same way. They're less polluting, they're healthier, and they can also be less costly as well. You know, when we're looking for solutions, we want to look for those types of alignments and avoid misalignments. You know, that separate the benefits and harms and distribute them in unequal ways. So I think what I mean to say by that is, you know, it's really hard to solve these problems with technology alone. Okay, there's an underlying social issue that we need to address. You know, when we're talking about the health of people, these are some of the factors that make someone more vulnerable, like the patient that I had. So poverty, social exclusion, chronic illness, vulnerable housing. And you know, going back to my patient that I was talking about at the beginning, what would have made her more resilient? What would have made it easier for her? Well, better housing with blinds or an awning to create more shade. That would have kept it cooler inside for her, but also it would have saved her money in terms of the energy needed to cool her place if she had a fan or an air conditioner. You know, better income support so that she could have afforded an air conditioner or a fan. Better social connection so that she had somewhere to go for help. Or someone to check on her. So one of the cool things I've heard about recently was in the UK, they actually have this program where postal workers will go and visit elderly people who are socially isolated and check on them as a way of maintaining those connections. And finally, access to healthcare services that prevent illnesses, that prevent chronic diseases from getting worse in the first place would have made her more resilient. These things aren't just beneficial for her, obviously. They're, you know, better shade and insulation means less energy, that means less pollution, that means less strain on our electrical grid, so we're less likely to have brownouts and blackouts in the summer. And healthcare services in general that prevent illness uses fewer resources, uses fewer public dollars in order to fund it. And so I'm coming to the end here, I promise. I wanted to bring that up because these are some of the benefits of taking this relational view, this relational approach to climate change. It allows us to see that there are multiple benefits to be had, not just health and economy and environment and isolation, but that we can gain multiple of these at the same time. And it also gives us ways of making climate change more meaningful. You know, you no longer have to be an expert to understand it. You know how it affects you, yourself, and the people around you. I think I want to leave some time for discussion, so I'm going to skip a whole bunch of stuff here. But I'll make a couple quick points, and I call the slide "Yes and" because I really like what a Canadian climate scientist named Katherine Hayhoe had said about this issue. I don't know if she was the first person who said it, but I really like it. She said that in finding approaches to addressing climate change, what we need is silver buckshot, not a silver bullet. Okay, we need multiple different ways of coming at it that are going to work for multiple people, and also that give us a variety of different options and tools. Let's see. Let's skip this. I don't think you need me to explain carbon pricing. That's just. What I did want to say about it is, in terms of looking at the multiple benefits of it, this was some data from the International Monetary Fund where they did an analysis of carbon pricing, and they found that in terms of being effective at reducing emissions, it was better than any one policy alone. But also in terms of reducing these deaths from air pollution, it was better than any one policy alone. But it's not to say that, if we have carbon pricing, that's it, we're finished. No, it's a very useful tool. It's an excellent tool, but you got to have other ones as well. The other benefit to having this relational approach is also that it gives the issue of climate change meaning. So people don't have a really hard time caring about numbers. It's much easier for people to care about people. And this was a famous study where they actually asked people how much money they were willing to give to save someone's life. And then they were asked, well, what about if there's 2 people or 3 people or 4 people or 5 people? And they find that, as the number of people increases, people's compassion about them fades. And so when we say that there's millions of people who will be affected around the world, or that the fire in Fort McMurray is 6 times more likely because of climate change, though that is much less meaningful than if you talk about what it means to you, or why it's important to your family, or how it's going to affect your community. That's going to affect the people around you much more. And so I just want to leave with this thought, and again, I'm not offering any particular solutions. What I would advocate for is that we take some of what we are learning about climate change and we ask our leaders to act on it in a way that aligns all of our interests. That if we're doing that, if we're doing other things, that we show each other what we're doing to make it more visible. And that we talk about climate change. Okay, the more that people talk about it, the more that people believing in it is not an issue anymore. Almost every Canadian does. It's that reinforces that it's an important issue and is going to be a major influence on our health and many other things in the near future. So to conclude. Resilience for ourselves and our communities, I think, involves making improvements to the ways that we live so that they pollute less. But it also involves understanding the connections between us to build stronger ties, find sustainable solutions, and to avoid conflict when times get tough. And it also means helping leaders to make decisions that boost resilience through institutions and policies that enable, empower, and activate people to take pathways to a healthier future. And I would love to just have a conversation at this point.